Today, the Committee for Sydney launches its benchmarking report. This is the 5th annual report the committee has undertaken and arrives in a year that we will see major turning point for cities around the world. And these reports are possible because we have some great innovation partners at the Committee for Sydney. You'll see a lot of the reports that we do online, and they have huge advocacy effects to policy for our government. And I'd like to thank the innovation partners that support the Committee for Sydney: Western Sydney University, the ICC Sydney, Campbelltown City Council, and of course DEXUS. Now, we would be meeting face to face in the DEXUS offices today, but unfortunately that's not to be, and we're online. So today we have two great speakers. Obviously, Eamon from the Committee for Sydney, who's Deputy CEO and Director of Policy. He's going to take us through the report. And our special guest all the way from the UK, who has come out of a hard lockdown and straight into a vaccine. But Greg, you haven't had the vaccine yet, I don't think. But yeah, the UK first cab off the rank. Professor Greg Clark is the Global Head of Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC. And Greg's going to provide a reflection on the year that was for cities all around the world and evaluate Sydney's performance in this report that we're about to present to you. Now, please, the Q&A is down on your bottom of your screen. Please pose some questions as we walk through the report and get the conversation started. And I'll do my best to get to your questions as we come to the Q&A towards the latter part of this morning. So, Eamon, let's get started. Over to you.
Thanks, Lynn, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us at this slightly earlier than normal hour for us, of course, slightly later than normal hour for Greg. I hope you can see my slides. Lynn, is that all? That all looks good.
All good.
Big, bright, and red. So yes, as Lynn said, this is one of my favourite events of the year, and I'm very sad not to be at DEXUS Place at the moment to be doing this event, because it's sort of the wonderful coda to the end of the year that we get to have each year, which is pause, reflect on where Sydney has been over the last year, and sort of reflect how those scores are, how it's scoring compared to the rest of the world. The report we're here to talk about is this report, and it will appear on our website shortly. We didn't want to let you see it before I got to talk about it, but in the next sort of hour it will be online and you're able to digest the detail of it. This is this year's benchmarking report, but of course it's the 5th of in a series of benchmarking reports that the Committee for Sydney has undertaken on Sydney all the way back to 2016. And you can see previous reports there. We don't do these reports alone. It's actually a partnership with an organisation called the Business of Cities that until recently Greg was the head of. But we've been working very closely with Dr. Tim Moonen and Jake Nunley and the team over there, who do wonderful work. And they really are the kind of the brains trust behind this report. They're the ones that crunch the data. They're the ones that think about that global nexus of Sydney and the rest of the world. And so we're really, really grateful to them. I want to say thanks to the team. And I'm taking my turn to present the data, but I promised Tim he would get to present it next year. So how does Sydney do this year? Well, we've got some competitive edges. We continue to be rated and regarded as more stable and open for business than other cities, and certainly COVID has proven that to be true. Our gateway role to Asia Pacific, as soon as we're allowed to have flights going to Asia Pacific, is enhanced by the public health challenges faced by Europe and North America. We have a good work-life balance, health, safety, and a natural environment, and we remain a top city for international students, the expat lifestyle, real estate investment, and all-round likability. These are fairly consistent trends. These are things that were true of Sydney more or less last year. They've been accelerated somewhat by COVID, but they are more or less good, strong, underlying foundations for Sydney to build on. But there are some emerging risks. Our reliance on populator and visitor-driven industries is threatened by, of course, reduced global mobility and the long-term shift towards remote working, hybrid conferencing, and the like. Our tech economy and digital infrastructure are underdeveloped. This is something that we worked quite strongly on in our innovation economy report earlier this year. But there's really an area where Sydney is behind the 8 ball, and certainly behind our peer cities. Air pollution spikes and slower action climate change has become a real issue, particularly this year in the benchmarks. And our more car-dependent development model means there's more barriers to overcome to become a walkable, bikeable, amenity-rich city. As a bit of a reminder of how these reports work, we take over 700 benchmarks, or Business of Cities takes over 700 benchmarks. We weight and categorize them into 12 different categories around the city, and we have a rolling score. So noting that some of these benchmarks are actually pre-COVID, because it's a sort of a 12-month 12-month rolling thing. And then we score against peer cities, because it's all well and good that we score very highly, but if we're only compared to, for example, cities that are nothing like Sydney, it's a bit of a false sort of perception. So we take this core group of 32 peer cities plus Sydney, 33 cities, and we score ourselves on that. This is how we score. We do pretty well, and you'll see here for a variety of these, you'll either be able to see from the last 2 years or the last 4 years how we're scoring. We score strongly. I'm going to go through each of these in turn. On a couple of areas, we get a couple of 10 out of 10s, but we also score poorly on a couple. Transport and infrastructure, only 3 out of 10. Sustainability, only 3 out of 10. To give you an idea of some example specific metrics where we score poorly or well, we're very well liked. We have good, high number of international students and low crime rate, but high CO2 emissions, poor trajectory of our startup ecosystem, and poor satisfaction with public transport. I'm going to jump straight into the content now. So the first section is business and finance. Finance and corporate dynamism, we score an 8 out of 10. It's a major competitive advantage for us. We're well established as the Southern Hemisphere's most connected corporate centre and leading fintech hub. And so that status really sort of has secured our position in that top 10 to 12 leading financial services centres globally. And I'd say that's fairly secure. We're a top 10 centre for fintech HQs. We're 10th in the world, the number of fintech HQs. And we have a pretty good percentage of our employees that work in corporate, financial and scientific sectors relative to Frankfurt. So you'll see we certainly score higher than a number of our peer cities. On business investment friendliness, this is one of our really core strengths. We're a friendly city for business than most of our peer cities that have really struggled to maintain a predictable environment. And certainly we've seen that through America and Hong Kong and the like. Despite higher labour costs and corporate tax rates, we continue to benefit from simpler business setup and exit arrangements. And the sentiment among global real estate investors is incredibly buoyant. So we remain in the top 20 cities globally for job creating international investments. A minor reduction, but broadly we're tracking very well on that. And it's really fairly low cost to start a business in Sydney. So this is an area of great strength for Sydney. On the knowledge economy, we score very well for talent and labour market. We have a track record of producing knowledge and skills that's consistently competitive. We have high calibre adaptive universities, strong career age population growth, and our skill base continues to expand. But there is a bit of a gap in this area. The real knowledge economy compared to many cities, Sydney compares peers. The likes of Toronto and Amsterdam have made faster progress at growing knowledge-rich and knowledge-hungry sectors than we have. So we're sort of seeing a bit of a gap emerge between potential and impact. So while we're growing our share of jobs that are high-paying high-tech industries, other cities are growing faster. So we can see this relative to access and quality of tech talent. We have average access basically, but the problem is that there's a heck of a lot of cities that have above average access to tech talent. And we should be aspiring to be, stepping up through the Berlins, the Stockholms of the world, the Parises, the Tel Avivs into that upper echelon of the San Franciscos, the London, the Seattles. We certainly have a very strong global talent reputation. Our universities, our skill base and our youthful population means that we score very well. But that really comes to that issue of we have a strong reputation for it, but it's perhaps not playing through into the lived experience. In higher education, another area we score very well. It's a core strength for Sydney up until COVID-19. Obviously, Sydney was one of the most in-demand destinations for students globally. And overall, scores remain impressively high, even as the landscape becomes more competitive. Our universities are very strong. They improve. The appetite for international students to come here has been consistent. And the pipeline of knowledge that universities produce is well regarded by potential employers. However, the curbs on international student travel and interaction will mean that the competitive landscape for higher education will change pretty dramatically in the next couple of years. Our underlying offer looks like it will remain very competitive, but we're going to have to be really responsive to what students look for, and we're going to have to be really quick off the mark as far as attracting students back to Sydney when we could potentially lose them to other places that are on the rise. We're a top 3. We're the 3rd highest number and share of international students in Sydney relative to other cities. Melbourne has a slightly larger share per population, but we have more international students than Melbourne. But we score very well on that. And our universities have a strong and improving reputation among employers. You can see we're sort of top 6 as far as cities around the world. So we score very well, Tokyo being number 1 in that city, in that metric. So a very strong area for us. Now we get to the ones that are not so great. There's been progress, but innovation remains a disadvantage for Sydney. The international competition to host the innovation economy has become widespread in recent years. And while our ecosystem is growing, it's growing slower than everybody else's. analysis, especially when you look at measures around capital raising, leading edge technology sectors. We have fewer local and experienced VC funds, less cumulative experience at running and financing startups and scale-ups. And so that means that we are at a disadvantage in this area. And COVID's going to accelerate that disadvantage because the atomization and the ability to work more remotely will detract from our sort of, I guess, livability opportunity. The number of high-tech innovation, tech-enabled HQs founded since 2000, we do okay. 18's not bad, but obviously scores poorly when in comparison to places like London, San Francisco. I feel like is an unfair comparator, but many other cities are beating us on this measure. And while we score well as far as tech meetups and innovation infrastructure, we score poorly on almost everything else. The research impact and patent generation, that commercialization problem is very poor, 1 out of 10. The scalability commercialization market reach, 1 out of 10. Funding access and the ecosystem value and exits. These are poor areas for Sydney. Lifestyle and environment, our livability score is pretty good, 8 out of 10. It remains a long-standing advantage for Sydney. We continue to top the charts for things like work-life balance, scenic outdoors relative to other cities. But the bushfires have had a really big impact on our benchmarks this year for this particular thing. And local perceptions of livability have become more decisive in benchmarks. So the attention has been focused onto things like how individuals and families enjoy living in a city, the work-life balance that they experience, traffic, safety, the amenity, regardless of where they live in the city. And as a result, Sydney is weighed down because whilst there are pockets of Sydney that are certainly very accessible with low traffic, there are vast swathes of Sydney that have issues like massive congestion. And we see that issue of the bushfires in the next slide. This is a chart showing rolling average weeks above unhealthy levels for air quality. Sydney had about 5 different weeks of above unhealthy level and very unhealthy, which is at 155. We had 5 days the end of last year that were above the very unhealthy rating, which makes it very difficult to go outside for anybody and to enjoy outside. 5 days was actually the second highest of any of the peer cities that we looked at. So it's a great concern for us that this is something that if the bushfire season becomes more consistent as a result of climate change, this is something that's going to massively drag down the livability scores of Sydney. That said, we remain very strong. We're third in the city on the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Livability Standard when we compare to our peer cities, obviously behind Vienna and Melbourne, but doing very well. And we remain a pretty good livable city. Wages and costs is another poor area for us. It's primarily as a result of unaffordability. Although we have competitive salaries and high purchasing power, it's more expensive to live in this place than almost any other city around the world, short of, global unhappy peers like Hong Kong and Vancouver, places that you don't really want to be like. This is something that's consistently been a problem for Sydney. And an interesting one, expats in Sydney are less satisfied with the cost of living here than other places. And if we want to attract that global talent to Sydney, this is a real concern. So you'll see the blue bar is the average across 82 cities, and then the red bar is us, and we're behind the 8 ball on every single one of these measures when it comes to how expats feel about living in our city. Sustainability is poor. It's a really poor area for Sydney. The lack of national action on climate change and the recent bushfires weigh on our city's score. And over the last 3 years, we've seen a gradual decline. 2020 has probably been the year where Sydney's sustainability threats have really become exposed in the benchmarking. The bushfires put paid to that. But this is something that's been a long-term trend for us. We own a lot of cars. That's a problem. Cars are very carbon intensive, and they reflect a built form and an urban form that's not very sustainable. And our environmentally friendliness is on the decline. One measure that I haven't included in these charts, but is true of last year and was true of this year, is Australia scores worst out of 63 countries around the world on our climate policy, absolutely last. So that remains a problem. We were 63 out of 63 last year, and we're 63 out of 63 this year. Another area that's been a gradual trend down is our score on transport and infrastructure. Although we're likely to start seeing an upward curve soon, that upward curve will be as a result of trains and metros and light rails opening. And we've had a couple open recently, but it's going to take quite a bit for us to play catch up. And we've talked endlessly over the last decade about the lost decade we had and the need to play catch up. But it's also compounded by the fact that Sydney's less walkable, it's less bike friendly, and our digital infrastructure is incredibly poor. Our internet speeds are slow, basically. and many other aspects of it. We're a very highly car-dependent city. Our mode share, so orange is cars. Our mode share is very high for cars, comparable to other cities around the world. And that's a concern when it comes to COVID, because it means that there's a real risk that the slow trend we had towards more public and active transport will actually be reversed as a result of people jumping back into their cars. And as noted, our broadband speeds are not keeping pace. And again, another problem, massive problem when we've seen with COVID is if more things are moving online and our internet speeds are poor, that's a problem. But there's one that I wanted to flag. This is actually a bespoke benchmark that the Business of Cities developed for us, and it's really cool. And I really want to just pause and take some time to talk about this because it is such an interesting piece of work. Business of Cities basically looked at a set of peer cities and crunched how much public transport infrastructure was being built or opened by these cities. The measure we've used is stations. Often length of track is not a very useful measure because you can have a very long train track that doesn't stop anywhere and you score very well, and then you find that in fact, you haven't actually achieved much because you haven't provided much connectivity. It's also looking at new stations rather than upgraded stations. So in the last 18 months, Sydney completed more public transport than any other jurisdiction in the world. We're leading the world in the last 18 months. And if we broaden that out to take into account the next 5 years as well as the last 18 months, we're third in the world after Paris and Tel Aviv. Paris is building a lot of everything. They're building a lot of metro, they're building a lot of light rail, and Tel Aviv's building a lot of light rail. So over the current cycle, we're building 31 metro stations, 35 light rail stops. That's more than London, Boston, Melbourne, and Singapore combined. And these are the numbers here. If you want to have a look, I love these numbers. It's a very exciting number to see. Sydney, as you'll see, is number 3 there, with 13 new metro and commuter rail stations over the last 18 months, 66 metro, heavy rail, and light rail stations over the next cycle. And 31 of those being metro. And so you'll see in comparison, that is substantially higher, well, it's slightly higher than places like Toronto, but then we see a substantial drop down to places like Vienna, Singapore, Seattle, all the way down through Vancouver. And there's in fact more, but I couldn't fit them on the chart, but they're zeros basically. What this means is that, for a long time, we've been talking about a massive infrastructure pipeline to Sydney, but with not much kind of global context of, well, is what we're building a lot, a little? Should we be impressed with how much the New South Wales government is investing in public transport or not? And I think we can categorically say the answer is yes, it is a lot. Yes, we should be impressed. It's actually world leading in many respects. And we are in that top echelon of the top 3 cities in the world as far as our investment in public transport at the moment. And that's a thing that's worth pausing on, celebrating and reflecting on when, although we score poorly on public transport in general, we are well poised to start seeing a shift in that and to see Sydney come back as a place of incredible strength. Moving on, culture and destination appeal. We score very well on diversity and inclusion. Our cohesion, our openness are very, very strong, and we've got a good cultural mix, welcoming and easygoing attitude and more progressive approaches to minorities than most other cities around the world. We score favourably in most most of our close peers. We're part of a group of places like Vancouver, Toronto, and Berlin that score consistently well. You'll see here we're in the ninth most demographically diverse city in the world, and our social cohesion is very strong. Slightly backwards, we've gone from 3rd to 4th, but still damn good. And so we're very that's a particular strength area for us. Visitor and cultural appeal is perhaps a little bit lower. We perform well as a tourism and consumption gateway. Our visitor events and sports economy is one of the most competitive in the world on a dollar for dollar basis, pound for pound basis. The main gap that has been seen is the variety of cultural and evening amenities on offer, which is going to be helped by our new 24-hour economy strategy. But we're unduly probably penalised a bit by studies that assess total volume of demand, given the distance that we are from many other places. But there's probably a bit of a perception issue as well, that we're not perceived as a city for world-class dining or culture. And also many benchmarks are starting to weight towards the quality of tourism across the whole city. And our cultural and destination appeal is very heavily weighted towards the east. So those are things that probably we need to work on. People spend more money in Sydney than they do elsewhere. We score very, very highly for the spend per resident, whilst we're behind, some of the major tourist locations, the European ones primarily, per resident. But we score very well on that. One area where we score poorly is access to cultural amenities. You'll see us down here, which is this is a a combination measure of museums, galleries, theatres and concert halls, and we have fewer cultural amenities than many other places, obviously London and Paris and Berlin, but places like Buenos Aires, Amsterdam, Toronto, Barcelona are far outscoring Sydney. Finally, brand image and influence is an area where we consistently score well. Global regard for Sydney remains high by global standards. It may gain a boost this year, it will gain a boost this year as a result of how we've dealt with COVID-19, certainly in New South Wales and Sydney, but Australia as well. Our image among global corporate and real estate investors as a city that deserves to belong in the conversation as the world's most investable locations also appears to be pretty resilient. We've maintained our status as a safe, attractive and politically stable option in the Asia Pacific. But the work to broaden and enrich Sydney's identity remains as important as it has been, and something that we've not done enough on. Many cities, Barcelona, Hong Kong, Amsterdam, London, Stockholm, are using the pandemic to start an identity rebuilding process that's more regional, more about quality and values over quantity and icons. And that's something that Sydney is yet to do. So we know we remain an incredibly likeable and appealing place after London. We're the most appealing and likeable place in the world. And whilst a little bit further behind, we remain a very competitive image amongst global investors, I should say, with a strong image from that we're in the top 20, number 15. So by and large, it's a story of, as they say, a story of two halves. Lots to like about how Sydney's scoring this year. Some things to work on, some that are consistent, but certainly some that have been exacerbated by COVID-19.
Thanks, Eamon. It'd be interesting because I think half of the report was in COVID, but we've obviously moved to the second half of the year and the future looks very different. There was one question that came through on business and investment. The fact that we did get a 10 out of 10, but does that include property development and investment? If you could just answer that before I hand over to Greg.
Yes, it does. It's probably got a bias towards international investment in property and real estate rather than domestic investment. But yes, that's absolutely included in that category. Terrific.
Well, Greg, lot to take in with this report. As Eamon said, we've done well in some areas and not so well in others. But it would be great to just get your perspective in the world that we're living in now, cities around the world. You know, what are your thoughts?
Well, firstly, Lynn and Eamon, I'd just like to say thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thank you to you and also the sponsors, and thank you to my colleagues at HSBC Australia who made it possible for me to be here. So my reaction to this report is firstly to say congratulations to the authors, Eamon and Tim, my former colleague. Just reading the executive summary of this rather wonderful report, I think it is brilliant in itself because it summarizes absolutely what we already know about Sydney, which is that Sydney is one of the world's most compelling, attractive, enjoyable, likable, and in a certain sense, entrepreneurial places on the planet. It's taken advantage from its particular location, the endowment that it's had from nature. It's really built a city based on cosmopolitan diversity and inclusion. It's made the most of its wonderful outdoor spaces, and it's created a city that is in a certain sense the envy of the world. But I think what the report also highlights is the other thing that we know about Sydney, that in a sense the world is moving in a slightly different direction from where it was when Sydney's success model was established. The world is moving more towards an innovation economy, more towards digitized platforms. It's moving more towards a different notion of livability that's not just about the attractiveness of the space, but also about the air quality, the walkability, and everything else that Eamon was talking about. And the world is moving more towards places that don't just have, as it were, appeal, but also have soft power. They have influence and the ability to prove to the world that they're changing their spots, and to get the world to tell their future story rather than their past story back to them. So there's quite a few things in what Eamon has said, I think, that are reasons to be conscientiously concerned, as well as being, appropriately congratulatory about Sydney. As you both know, I love Sydney, and doesn't take much to get me down to Sydney for all sorts of reasons. But I am concerned that what we're witnessing now, inspired and accelerated by COVID-19, is much more of a sea change than perhaps may be obvious to the naked eye. So, for example, over the last 9 months, although I haven't been traveling much, I've virtually visited a huge number of cities: Amsterdam and Miami and Toronto and Tel Aviv and Shanghai and Suzhou and Nanjing and Singapore and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Istanbul and Santiago and Buenos Aires and many, many others. And what I would say is that there's a shift going on. These cities are using COVID-19 to begin to remake the success model. Now, part of that, I think, is about a new approach to public space and to place. If you like, nearly all of those cities have decided that a decisive shift towards the human being and against the motor car is a very important part of their next chapter. Nearly all of those cities have decided that a dependence upon either tourism or international students or foreign corporates is no longer the success model, and they have to focus much more on indigenous economic growth. That means the innovation economy, that means their enterprise systems, that means their ability to capitalize small growing firms, that's their ability to build those ecosystems of growth. Many of them are thinking in a new way about how to finance the city, and this means the city becoming the city as a service, not just the city as a set of institutions or systems, but increasingly these cities are thinking about how in this new sort of hybrid age, where agility and the use of digital platforms to be in two places at once, as it were, is going to enable cities to have a new kind of population strategy. I can count now on 2 hands the number of cities that are developing strategies for part-time residents. The city as a subscription service, if you like. You may live in city X, but you can be in city Y 25, 30, 40 days of the year, where you can own a firm, you can invest in land, you can create a startup. And so, if you like, this big push on sustainability, on digitization, on public health, on a new social and environmental contract, on the reworking, I think, of global supply chains and trade routes that are the longer term changes that are coming from COVID-19, are inducing a kind of remaking of the success model for several cities. And they're beginning to think about a way of operating in a COVID adjusted world, rather than returning to the old business models and the old competition frameworks. And so part of what I think Eamon was saying very aptly is that the way that the world views cities and the way it uses these indexes and benchmarks to monitor and measure cities is itself changing towards the direction of these new models of success. And in these new models of success, some of the things that Eamon mentioned are actually more critically important than they were in the last cycle. So if we just use this as a last cycle, next cycle story, in the last cycle, it was very, very important to have a strong visitor brand and to be very popular with investors. I think in the next cycle, it's going to be much more important to be attractive to mobile talent. And that's going to be a lot about livability. In the last cycle, it was extremely important to keep telling the world how good your universities were. Now, that I suspect will never change. That's been true for several hundred years. But in the next cycle, it's going to be much more important to talk about how you commercialize, how you scale up, and how you grow knowledge-based industries, and what it is that you do to make that happen. In the last cycle, notions of livability were a lot about, the beauty of the natural environment, the private amenities that individuals could enjoy, the idea that you could, be on the beach at lunchtime, as it were, and back in the office. Those kinds of amenities, if you like, the leisure aspect of livability was very important in the last cycle. In the next cycle, I think it's going to be a lot about the day-to-day livability of the city, what the journey to work is like, how the city is reorganized so that work is closer to home and home is closer to work, how a family can exist without a motor car in a city, and those sorts of things. So that's probably enough as an opening remark. There's lots here to be pleased about. The question is, if we try to polish our crystal balls up and ask a few more questions about what the next cycle is going to be like, the big question is Sydney ready?
Great, thanks, Greg. I want to start with a question about leadership, because you mentioned you've been around the world virtually and cities are making this shift. They're taking the opportunity during COVID to really move. What have you seen, who's leading this? What have you seen around the world that's made that shift pretty quickly and are heading in a new direction?
Well, it's a great question, Lynn, and as you know, every city has a kind of different leadership model. You know, I've been virtually in Shanghai several times this year. Shanghai is a big, powerful metropolitan city government with an extremely powerful mayor, a big fiscal base, and basically the city government can lead itself in Shanghai. On the other hand, in Tel Aviv, where, if you like, you've got a smaller municipal government, a big metropolitan area, completely uncoordinated. There's no Greater Sydney Commission for Tel Aviv. Actually, a lot of what's happening there is led by NGOs, foundations, citizens groups. It's led by local governments occasionally cooperating with each other, but a lot of it is driven by the corporate sector and particularly the technology sector. Whereas if you were to shift your attention, let's say, over to somewhere like Amsterdam, where I've been just last week off and on for a couple of days, it's very clear that what's happening in Amsterdam is that there's a very strong sort of civic alliance of 33 local governments working together with a national government that's seeing an opportunity in both Brexit and in COVID to reposition the Netherlands and Amsterdam, with very strong support from the corporate sector as well. Whereas if you look up to Toronto, let's say, in Toronto, you still see the vestiges of the Toronto City Summit Alliance, a group that was created 20 years ago, where the 4 universities and the corporate sector, alongside the provincial government, very, very strongly leading the agenda with the mayor and with the leaders of the other municipalities. So a strong all-round base, but a real centre of gravity in civic leadership. Now, of course, Sydney, I often talk when I'm abroad about Sydney's wonderful sort of emerging leadership framework. The Committee for Sydney itself as an agenda setter, the Greater Sydney Commission as a brilliant example, I think, of how a state government can internally re-engineer itself around a metropolitan area, and increasingly, I think, proactive local governments in the Greater Sydney area. Where I think there's a little bit missing is, in a sense, the commitment of the private sector and the institutional sector, not so much to the agenda setting, which they're very, very good at, but I think to some of the more project or initiative or transformational partnerships that are about changing the business model. For example, on venture capital or translational research or the creation of new districts. So I don't wish to be in any sense critical. I just think there's further to go. There's been a tendency in Australia to think that leadership was the job of government per se. And actually, the lesson from nearly all successful cities is that leadership is a partnership activity. It's distributed amongst the capable. And if you have capable businesses and institutions and others, they better get involved with sleeves rolled up. So agenda setting is very important, but actually practical initiatives may be even more important.
No, great response there. It's very much a public-private partnership, isn't it, leadership? And the committee plays a great role in that. I want to come to a couple of points on lifestyle and environment, because we didn't score so well there. But I'm interested in the innovation piece. I mean, we need to be at the forefront of innovation. I think through COVID, you know, Sydney businesses, small businesses have, you know, switched to different products of advanced manufacturing and created sanitisation, sanitisers from gin distilleries, and we've seen amazing innovation. But we always suffer with the commercialisation of that innovation and the attraction of venture capital. What do we need to do to turn that around? Because it presents in the report year after year as a struggle for Sydney.
It's a great, go on.
Oh, Greg, could I give some corporate committee for Sydney thoughts on that? And then I'd really love that global perspective from you, Greg, if that's all right. I mean, one of the things, this was the commercialization of technology and research into you know, scalable and globally competitive ideas was a big focus of the Innovation Economy report. There is lots, I mean, there are as many opinions about the specific problems Sydney faces and why we score poorly on this as there are people who have expertise on this. But a couple of things that really came through quite strongly. The first is there's actually a lot less government support for innovation and for translational research than in many other jurisdictions that are doing this very well. So that's more research funding basically for universities. The other issue we have is we've got a much more disparate private sector with a lot more SMEs that are not really capable of undertaking that deep long-term partnership arrangements with research institutions to commercialize those ideas. You know, they're too small, they're just trying to survive. They say, look, I can't sign a 3-year agreement to maybe get this groundbreaking idea up and running in 3 years' time. I don't know if I'll exist in 3 years' time. And that's been a big challenge for Sydney, that we need to have more scalable organisations or a better framework to support those SMEs to engage quite well. I'm really pleased to see that specifically has been a really core focus of the work around the Western Sydney Aerotropolis and the kind of core industry work happening there. But I certainly think more needs to be done, and I definitely think we need to be pushing federal government to be funding university research a lot more to support that area as well.
Great, Eamon.
Makes a lot of sense, Eamon. I mean, Lynn, my point would be that let's look at some of the world-class places in this regard. So if you look at North America, it's Boston and Massachusetts. It's obviously Washington, D.C. It's increasingly New York and Philadelphia. It's Toronto. It's Austin, Texas. It's Northern California. And if you look in Europe, it's Berlin. It's London. It's, of course, it's very much Stockholm increasingly. Amsterdam has a big play here. Tel Aviv doing very well. Seoul, very active in this space. Tokyo actually very strong here. There are different models of how this works. For some, this is innovation that comes out of industrial strategy. And having industrial strategy is very important. Knowing what you're good at and what you could be good at, and pursuing it with a real focus and investing in not just the R&D, but also the capital goods that you need to be able to do it is very important. But there are a number of other places around the world that sort of share Sydney's challenge. So just last week, Barcelona launched a whole series of platforms in this space where really it's trying to do 4 things at once. One, be very clear about a set of sectors and subsectors that it can work on and try to build an international community around them. Secondly, focus very, very strongly on creating enterprise ecosystems that support. So this is not just the idea that small businesses sort of stand in a row and hold hands with universities and with businesses. It's much more about building strong platforms that can support them. So generally, these are sector-based innovation agencies. The third thing is clearly dealing with the growth finance challenge. It's not just a venture capital issue. But what everybody knows is that you have to work simultaneously on making your companies more investable. And at the same time, you have to induce somehow some capital plays that bring the venturing market to your region. And that can be a subsidy, it can be a matching fund, it could be a sidecar fund. There's lots of ways of doing this. For a period of time, you may have to subsidize the venture capital in order to demonstrate to it what the returns can be. And then the fourth area I think, Lynn, is the one that you're very much involved in, which is helping your region to become famous for 2 or 3 areas where you believe you can develop an edge. I think Austin, Texas has done this incredibly well. Barcelona's starting to do this very well. Vienna is beginning to do it. Taipei is now doing it. So you've got to build a brand. You've got to make yourselves visible as an innovation location, because that's absolutely critical to attracting talent as well as attracting capital. So there's no easy solution here, but I think that Eamon's fundamental point, that it involves government investing dollars in the R&D, is absolutely correct. It needs a long-term commitment, but it's possible to do that on its own and still not get an innovation economy out of it if you don't do these other things as well.
Yeah, I think there's a good step in the right direction. We've got 5 innovation precincts that the government and industry are really focused on: tech and innovation 1, med tech, obviously the Aerotropolis, which you're very familiar with, in terms of setting up a STEM institute and looking at defence and agribusiness. So I think we have a focus on where we have competitive advantage. 2 questions leading into that. 1 about then attracting the talent, and 2 then promoting to the world. So if I look at talent first, and you will see this, cities are competing for talent all around the world. I think Sydney in Australia is in a really good position from a livability perspective, and that safety of managing COVID and the economy really well. We must be, you know, the world must be looking at us going, I want to live there right now and I want to work there. How do we convert that? We've got a lot of expats coming back at the moment, so many from Silicon Valley. You know, how do we put out to the world now that we are open for that talent?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very big strategic issue for you. So I'm going to be a little bit more downbeat and say that people would hear all of the things that you just said, and if they're not Australian, they might say, yes, you're right, I must visit Sydney. That's not the same as I must move to Sydney. Now, you have a unique one-off opportunity with an Australian diaspora returning for all sorts of good reasons. How you keep them and how you create incentives for them to translate what they've learned working in Silicon Valley and London and New York and everywhere else, and turn, in a sense, their know-how into scalable businesses. That's a really interesting kind of strategic challenge for you, because in a couple of years' time, that new cycle that I talked about a few minutes ago, with its slightly changed imperatives from the last cycle, I think will eradicate the advantages that you've just described about being a safe place and an attractive place and everything else. You see, people in the end, I think, will only move to Sydney if they believe, if they're aspiring people, if they believe that they can fulfill their potential in Sydney. Now, Sydney's obviously offering everybody who comes, who's got the money to pay for it, a wonderful quality of life. But some people are going to look at Sydney and say, I must send my children there to get their education. I must visit, I must go to a conference there. But actually, I'm going to fulfill my potential more likely in Singapore or in Guangzhou, or perhaps in Seoul, if I want to do that, or maybe in Shanghai, or perhaps in Riyadh, right? Or perhaps in Dubai. So there's a lot of other places that are competing to be the places where you can fulfill your potential. And many of them are now offering these 30-day golden visas. They're offering exemptions on investment in firms. They're offering facilitated, enabled ways to acquire land and to buy houses. So that global war for talent has just gone into its next chapter, where fiscal policies, educational support for families, investment opportunities, much more liberal visa regimes are going to be part of this new city as a service agenda, where you'll be able, as I said before, to continue to live in New York or San Francisco, but have literally your second home in Riyadh or in Taipei or in Seoul, and have that enabled and facilitated for you by the government. So it's about being a lot more, I think, proactive in how you attract that talent, but also a lot more proactive in how you take the advantage of this dividend of the diaspora returning in just the way the Irish did. I mean, I'm sure everybody in Australia has studied the Celtic Tiger case study. I mean, Irish diaspora were really incentivized to move back to Dublin by 50% discounts on income tax and all sorts of other things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I jump in? I mean, I think I agree with everything Greg says there, and with the name Eamon Waterford, shockingly, I had studied that Irish Tiger experience. Two little sort of case studies to demonstrate where Sydney is behind the 8 ball on these things. On the visa regime, it's actually quite difficult to get a permanent visa to Australia to become a permanent resident.
Yeah.
So if you're a student who comes to Sydney, the pathways to permanent residency are nearly non-existent. You put that in comparison to somewhere like Canada, a traditional competitor of Australia. If you are accepted into a startup hub, if you have a startup idea and you're accepted into a strong startup hub, basically they use the eligibility criteria for that startup hub as proof that you have a real, genuine innovation idea, and you can prove you've got enough income to support yourself at minimum wage for 1 year, which in Canada is 16,000 Canadian dollars, about $17,000 Australian. They will give you a permanent visa, permanent residency on day one. You walk through the door, you say, yep, I've got 16 grand in a bank account, here's a bank statement, and I'm accepted into that startup hub. You're in and you're here for life. It's nothing like that in Australia. Similarly, I think many of the cities that are successfully attracting that talent, their global brand, the brand they're selling to the world, is consistent, uniform, and singular. London is not talking about East London as a separate entity to London. There is a consistent brand that tells the diversity of stories that a city has to offer, but also shares the overflow of benefit that each of those components has. And I think Sydney maybe is running a little bit of a risk with this really strong precinct-based work that we're doing of actually having some confusing brands that aren't actually working together. This focus on the Western Sydney Aerotropolis as not necessarily Sydney, but Western Sydney or Western Sydney Airport, I think actually can potentially have some risks for Sydney that we're not sharing the complementary benefits across the whole city with those pitches.
Really good point, Eamon. Just leading on the global talent, I want to talk about the brand now. It's interesting, I had a conversation with a tech company that's based here, headquartered in US, want to set up a centre of excellence. And the headquarters said, but where will the talent come from? You only have a couple of universities there. And I thought, wow, okay, so we have a brand, an image issue that maybe nobody knows that we have the 11 universities and the knowledge economy and the innovation piece. And I just wonder how, our Premier is really keen to have headquarters set up here for domestic and international organisations. And I think we've got a lot of work to do on rounding that brand piece. To your point, Eamon, we've got a lot to talk about. How do we pull it together, use the soft power assets that you mentioned, Greg, and tell our story to the world. So I know we repeat this conversation every year. Yeah, I think it's time now that we pull that together. If you have any comments on that.
Well, I really want to encourage you to do that, Lynn. I mean, I've been visiting Sydney regularly for 6 or 7 or 8 years now, and every year I've come, I've said this, and every year I've come, everybody said, yeah, that's what we think too. And I think, well, fine. But you see, I think the problem is that there's some kind of dilution of the message. People get into thinking that branding and marketing should be transaction oriented. So it comes down to, in your case, Lynn, can we win the next event? or in the cultural space, can we win the next exhibit? Or in the tourism space, how do we get the next, the next wave of visitors? Or it comes down to a question about whether we can land the next firm that's looking for investment. And of course, all of those are aspects of the micro competition that you're in all of the time in a multiplicity of different sectors. But there's something else too. And that something else is the world's understanding of Sydney. The story that the world wants to tell about your place, its understanding of the coherence, the proposition, the ideas, the values that underpin the place, its understanding that it's more than the visitor destinations, more than the iconic architecture. You see, the more you emphasize branding and marketing around these transactions, the more you become only the assets that win those transactions, the less you become the full personality that your city has. So it's very clear that cities, for example, that really pump up their tourism economy end up with a very lopsided brand profile, because everybody thinks they're just beaches and hotels and places to have fun. Or cities that really just boost their foreign direct investment agenda, people end up thinking of them as sterile corporate locations where you might one day want to locate a firm, but you're not going to go there and spend your life there because the quality of life. So you have to counterbalance these transaction-led marketing efforts with a much bigger, more vocal, more powerful story about the whole place and about the long term.
Yeah.
And the problem is that's not easily done by politicians who, for all sorts of reasons that we understand very well, are constantly thinking about the next set of elections, and they have to do that. So you do need to create a civic alliance that's prepared to tell the story of the city in a more long-term framework, a more politically neutral way, and to put all of the other transaction-based marketing into a proper frame so that you can then see the whole picture. Otherwise, you'll only be famous for your last transaction. That's the problem.
Great advice. And it is storytelling. It's not the transaction, it's storytelling and a united effort. I've got a question here online, and I have been bundling up some of these questions. There's one about your comment on sea change. Should these sort of reports include comparisons on cities by quality of internet, adoption of Internet of Things, friendliness to open data, and other innovation driving fundamentals? I think that's a really great question.
Can I jump in?
Go on.
No, Greg, this is your space, mate. You are the smart cities man. I'll throw it to you first.
And you've got 6 minutes left.
Well, the answer is yes, and this report does, of course, highlight Sydney's underwhelming performance on digital infrastructure, on connectivity, on the flexibility and agility of the digital systems. It does reflect upon Sydney's relatively low uptake of micro-mobility systems, mobility as a service more generally. It does point to the fact that, the adoption of, what we might call smart building approaches, smart place, smart space, that Sydney is understood to be behind on those things. Now, Eamon will tell you, I think, in a minute, there will be opportunities to do more, maybe even a special feature on that in future years. But it's clearly the case that this is linked to this whole idea of what do we mean by livability. And all I would say is that in the news cycle I was trying to characterize for you 20 minutes ago, technology is an enabler of the city becoming a service so that citizens can have much more choice about how they travel, about where they live, about how they work, how they consume, how frequently they move between place of domicile and place of work, how agile the city centre is in reconvening itself. We'll probably come on to city centres in a minute. But I think all of that's going to be very, very important. It's not that I want Sydney to become a smart city. I just want Sydney to fulfil and to optimize its potential using all of the tools at its disposal, including the technology tools.
Yeah, so a point of clarification. I obviously touched on a couple of benchmarks. There are dozens of other benchmarks under the hood, including a couple around IoT, which we score, maybe 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10 on. So we score okay, but not great, certainly not great. Absolutely, we need to be doing more on this. I think the opportunity to leverage technology is one that we really need to be undertaking, because the scale and the built form of our city is, we have such a widely dispersed city, and COVID's going to have such a dramatic impact on how people use the city, that if we don't use technology to make more efficient use of the infrastructure and the lifestyle that we have today, it's just too costly for us to reverse engineer Sydney into a city of livability style. We can't be Barcelona, we can't be Paris, let alone London or New York, but we can use technology to be a more efficient version of Sydney that actually drives the dividends you see in some of those other cities without the dramatic cost it would take to reverse engineer the physical form of the city.
Mm. And so I want to finish on the question about cities. Greg, you've talked about blended cities. We're now sort of into this COVID normal. We're at 55% occupancy roundabout in our central business district, and we're predicting maybe 70% maybe where we'll cap out. What's your thoughts on what cities will look like in the future? What will that look like for the local and the visitor alike?
Well, it's the big, $500 or $50 million question, Lynn. I mean, none of us knows is the first answer. And I think what Eamon just said is very important, that every city enters this new cycle of change with slightly different parameters. Cities are agile in certain ways, and they're rigid in others. And the key bit is to know the things you can't change, but be very clear that you're going to change the things that you can change. My broad prediction, firstly, is that Sydney's going to be a successful city for a long time to come, right? But my broader prediction is that I do think that we will see some big adjustments in what city centres are used for. That doesn't mean the end of the office or even the end of city centre retail. But it does mean that our city centres will make a shift away from primarily servicing commuters, corporates and consumers, to take 3 C's. And I think they're going to move much more towards being places of habitat, places to live with all of the amenities that are required. And they'll be able to use a resident population to underpin a lot of amenities. They're going to be places of the experience economy. So not just retail, not just entertainment, not just food and beverage, but a new mix of those things that also brings in health and leisure and education and art and lots of participative activity. And the third thing is they're going to have to become hubs of innovation, because as I think we all know, innovation requires that face-to-face and face-to-place type of interaction. That means that it's really at a premium in city centres. So I think that Sydney will have to make some adjustments as the number of people staying in hotels, the occupancy in the offices, the reduced number of people doing face-to-face retail, and I would suggest the reduced number of students who are going to be here in the city for 36 weeks of the year, because many of them will be on modular programs where they don't have to visit quite so frequently, that the loss of that kind of demand is going to have to be taken up by a new kind of demand. And I think it's the 3 things I've just said. I think there's a counterbalancing point to make as well, Lynn, which is that there are, of course, opportunities for locations outside the city centre. On the one hand, the metropolis of 3 cities strategy seems to me to be a perfect post-COVID strategy. It's just that it was written before COVID. And at the same time, some of the ideas about the sandstone region, about the wider sort of regional economy that could emerge when people only have to travel, as it were, to the urban hub 4 times a month rather than 4 times a week, it creates a different geography in the housing market and the labour market, providing that the connectivity works, both the digital and the surface connectivity. So I can easily see that the future for cities is about a more hybrid, more distributed, more agile kind of city. But in every circumstance, particular local specificities will determine what character that takes. So my little anecdote is this one. 2 weeks ago, I called all of my colleagues in New York, and none of them were in New York. They were all somewhere else. And many of them were hundreds of miles away from New York, busily getting on with their New York-based job, but from another location. On the same day, I called all of my colleagues in Shanghai, and all of them were in the office in central Shanghai. So it just goes to show you that despite the obvious differences in where the virus was at different waves, different points of development of our urban systems around the world also influence how these things will play out, as well as different kinds of urban assets and urban infrastructures. So it won't look the same everywhere, would be my point. But there are reasons to be very optimistic about Sydney, and I think it's a case of really thinking about what this next cycle is and deciding to really take the bull by the horns.
Great lead into maybe the committee for Sydney's next report, Eamon. Look, we are at time. Greg, I know it's late there in the UK. We always love having you, you know, comment and your commentary on Sydney and cities all around the world. We learn an enormous amount from you, and we do implement quite a bit of what you suggest. So thank you so much for joining us this morning here in Australia. Eamon, thanks for producing the report with our innovation partners at the Committee for Sydney. And to everyone that's online, thank you for joining us 8 a.m. this morning. I hope you got some great advice out of this report and this morning's session, and good day to you all.
Lynn, just quickly, this is, I mean, also quickly thanks to Business of Cities, our partners who did this work, but this is our last event of the year. So for those that are online that have enjoyed this online series, we'll see you in 2021. Have a great break.
Fantastic, Eamon. Terrific. Bye, everyone. All righty. I think we're on.